Today we are interviewing Kay Moller Todd, who has held the position of Senior Legal Researcher at the law firm of Paul Hastings, Janarski and Walker in Atlanta since 1983. Prior to that, Kay worked as a librarian for another firm as a reference librarian at the Georgia State Library and as assistant reference librarian at Columbia University Law Library. Kay, let's begin with a little personal history. Can you tell us about when you were, where you were raised and about your life both when you were young and today?
I grew up in the city of Chicago. My family lived there in...
Speak up a little bit.
You'll cut it.
I'll cut that out.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm nervous. Try and speak a little bit more loudly just to be on the safe side.
Okay. I grew up in the city of Chicago. My father was a Norwegian immigrant and my mother's parents had emigrated, and I grew up in a Scandinavian section of Chicago and later we moved to a suburb. It was a wonderful place to grow up, and I always felt fortunate that AALL had its headquarters in Chicago and I could refresh my memory about my birth city.
What about your education and professional training? What degrees do you hold, and where did you go to college and then to library school?
I was one of the first 100 students to attend New College in Sarasota, Florida, which is now a part of the university system, but at the time it was one of several colleges that were founded in the early 60s with often innovative programs. And in September 1964, 100 entering freshmen or first-year students came to Sarasota and attended New College. We finished in 3 years. Part of its program was to graduate students through a concentrated 3-year program. And then I was somewhat uncertain what I wanted to do, so I headed to New England. My future husband was headed to Yale Law School, and I ended up at Columbia University as a special student in the graduate program. I was taking graduate history courses, modern European, history of Hungary, history of other European countries, and I realized quickly it wasn't at all what I wanted to do. So after a semester of that, I knew I needed to make a change. That fall, I was looking for a job on campus and went to the library's Human Resources Department and asked if I could get a part-time job just to help pay my expenses, and was hoping for a job in the college library, which was would have been a nice place to be and maybe a chance to pick up a few books for the things I was studying. But they said they needed people in the law library, and so I went to work as the student assistant, the lowest level student assistant in the Columbia Law Library. Part of my job was to sit at the desk as people left, ask them to show their briefcases and make sure they didn't have any books in it. Other times I collected circulation cards and filed them, so right at the bottom of the hierarchy. But Columbia was fabulous to me. I liked my job. When I dropped out of my 3 or whatever history classes and was just staying in New York because my husband was still up in Connecticut, they said, well, we could give you a full-time job as a full-time circulation assistant, and you could, perhaps that would be sufficient for you to stay with us. So I did that. And then they said, well, would you like to be the circulation supervisor? So I became the circulation supervisor at the Columbia Law Library in an astronomically fast rise to the top. And at that point, when I became full-time with them, they said, you're eligible for free credits every semester. Why don't you go to library school? So the director of the library then was a fellow named Ed Shuck, who had come in through, not through a library background, he'd been in the JAG Corps of the Army. He was a wonderful mentor, just treasured his employees, and he encouraged me to do it. So I became I guess it took 18 months. I got my library degree on free credits, and during that time, Morris Cohen was teaching the legal research class at Columbia. Reference librarian was Sam Cohen, but Morris Cohen came over to teach the legal research class. And they introduced me to him, and he asked me if I would like to grade the papers people turned in. So I became somewhat of a student assistant for the legal research class. And the story keeps getting better. At the end of my degree, I got my degree in the summer of '69, and there was an opening for a reference librarian. And Sam Cohen, the head reference librarian, asked me if I would consider the job. And so I spent almost 12 months being an assistant reference librarian at Columbia. So I got my master's from Columbia, my bachelor's from New College, and I really value both of those degrees.
Well, you've talked a little bit about your time at Columbia now and some of the people with whom you've had the opportunity to work. Did any of them play any particular role in perhaps recruiting you into law librarianship as such, as opposed to perhaps some other type of library work?
You know, I think had I stayed in New York, I would have had many opportunities to stay with law librarianship. When I left and was moving with my husband for his job in Atlanta, Morris Cohen, who I just had really what amounted to a passing contact with, said, if you ever need a reference, I'll be happy to provide a reference. Obviously, the librarians at Columbia agreed to provide a reference. And including at that time some people who were at Columbia, not Ed Schuck, not Sam Cohen, but Mira Pimsler was the head of acquisition. Mm-hmm. Dorothy Chamberlain was the head of cataloging. And they all were perfectly willing to say that I had been an effective starting reference librarian. I think by the time I left New York, I was committed to law librarianship. I found it intellectually interesting. I enjoyed my time at the circulation desk learning if somebody said I need the Hornbook on torts, that I should give them Prosser. And so the years that I spent at Columbia were just a continual learning process. Working as an assistant reference librarian, the professors would come down and they'd ask for help with updating a footnote, finding some esoteric government document. So I really felt challenged, and I enjoyed it very much.
It's interesting that you started off as a student assistant and worked your way up to being in charge of circulation. I always thought of the poor person that does the circulation supervision as having one of the hardest jobs in the place, because you're corralling all the student assistants.
Yes, and on some level, if you step back from it, I mean, we would create almost test experiences to make sure they would put the treatises in order. Then I'd go down and see if they'd done it, and then obviously with some of them you had to explain that, well, they needed to pay more attention. And so, I mean, I think it was an interesting experience. One of the people I worked with went on to become a pottery artist, and others moved in different directions. But I don't think it was my supervision that sent them to other careers.
Probably not. It may have been your supervision that motivated them to be successful in those other careers.
Find something else, perhaps.
Yes. Would you describe some of your specific positions, other than during that era of your career, that you've held in some of your jobs over the years since, and some of the things you've been able to accomplish in those positions?
When we came to Atlanta, I was looking for a law library job, and I looked in the AALL directory, and I found listed what appeared to be a library job for the perhaps Supreme Court of Georgia, Georgia Supreme Court. Emory was listed as a member. There was Fulton County Law Library, Atlanta's home county, or one of them. And I think then there was the State Law Library of Georgia, which was under the Secretary of State. And I wrote to all of them, and no one responded to me. We moved down here. And just to put in context what I'll tell you next, Columbia had been locked down, Yale to some extent too, the previous year. '69, there was the moratorium day, Vietnam War protests were very active. Columbia was very effectively shut down, and there are pictures that everyone saw of the military-dressed New York police on the corners around the law school. And so it was a time of definite unrest. The trial in New Haven of some of the supporters of the Black Power or the anti-Vietnam War protests were vivid in everybody's minds. So we came down here and I had no job. I called Emory, and the director then, I believe his last name was Hinsey, expressed some interest, said, send me your resume, or he already had it. He decided he had a cataloging librarian job and asked if I was interested in that. And that I could move into reference, which was my first love, when something became available. I followed up with the Georgia Supreme Court, found out there was no law library, despite the directory. I communicated with the state law librarian, the one who worked under the Secretary of State, and he offered me a reference position. I interviewed for that, and I interviewed at Emory. When I interviewed at Emory, they commented on the fact that what did I think about all the protests, and had I been part of them? And I was, of course, very careful. I decided it was unlikely I could move from cataloging to reference, and I really didn't want to do cataloging. So I took the job with the state law library. On my first day, one of the cataloging people asked if I was a communist because I'd been in New York. So this was a different place. Atlanta was a very different place then from what it is now. I stayed at the state law library for 2 years. I thought that for my resume to look right, I had to keep every job at least 2 years. But I knew in the first week it was not a place that I was going to be comfortable. The quality of the reference answers was, by everyone else, was such that I often felt like I had to say, well, let me suggest something else. And so the head reference librarian, who had been a public librarian, it was a difficult situation, I think. She was very, very pleasant in her gracious Southern way, but it wasn't what I wanted to do long term. The patrons, though, were people, lawyers from law firms who did not have everything they needed, and they came to what was a good Georgia archival, Georgia practice collection, as well as for federal documents, Georgia documents, and some secondary sources on non-Georgia law. And I met a number of them. So after I'd been at the state law library for 2 years, one of them said, we're looking to hire a librarian with training in a law library. Would you be interested? And so that came right about 2 years. I interviewed for that job and got that job. And that was then Kilpatrick, Cody, Regenstein, McClatchy, I think there was a fifth name. A firm founded years before in Atlanta, one of the early ones, and really a fine firm that had invested a lot over the years in establishing a very substantial law library. They were proud of it. They were proud to be able to offer other lawyers in the city the chance to use their library. And it was really a nice place to work. I was very, very happy there. We ultimately added staff. And I think the librarians filed. When I came, I'm not sure if I filed loose leaf services or not, but at the time, another librarian hired at a different large law firm had to work the reception desk at noon. And so I felt fortunate that they just wanted me as a librarian and for reference work. Over time we grew, and I think I had 2 other staff working for me, but gradually the administration became a more predominant part of what I was doing than I wanted to. So I was looking, but I stayed there 10 years and left with good feelings on my part, and certainly let them know I'd enjoyed the experience. I went to Paul Hastings. Janofsky and Walker were now just Paul Hastings. I followed one of their partners who had always given me really interesting work to do, and who left with a small group in 2 years before I joined Paul Hastings. And he and I continued to talk about the possibilities for me coming in just to do reference and research work that would be chargeable to his clients. And our discussions were carried on in various lunch establishments. And we finally made a proposal to Paul Hastings, headquartered then and now in Los Angeles, to make a proposal that I would come in as a senior legal researcher with a billable quota. At that time, there were a couple other branches of Paul Hastings, and they had filing services. And they cataloged the books from the other offices. So I really could come in and reduce my administrative load and come in with the assumption by this office that I would be doing chargeable time, doing things I could do better because they were either non-legal or because they were legal research that I did so routinely, I could do preliminary work and pass my results on to lawyers. So it was fascinating work, and I just felt incredibly valued by Paul Hastings. I still do.
Well, you've been with them a number of years now, and it sounds like the job has sort of reconnected you with what was exciting in your student days, which was the law reference work you were doing at Columbia.
Yes, I think that's true. I now work primarily for the employment department and have a billable hour budget, and so the library is only peripherally related to me. Certainly, it's not even a dotted line anymore.
Yeah.
But the firm was incredibly supportive of a non-lawyer and my professional activities. So.
Well, you certainly have had some rather significant professional activities, and you've served our profession in many diverse and very important ways. These include being president of the Atlanta Law Libraries Association, president of the Southeastern chapter of AALL, and one of relatively few really transformational presidents of AALL. I don't say that lightly, but on your watch there were some changes that had to be made, and you worked effectively to get those made. Let me digress just briefly, though, that prior to your service as the AALL president, you served as chair and a member of many committees. I want to mention your position as chair of the Special Committee on the Future of AALL, on which you served in the mid-1980s, and then followed a few years later by the position of chair of the Special Committee on Organizational Structure of AALL. These were perhaps in some ways only preliminary to what you did as AALL's president. During your watch, as president that is, you hired Roger Parent as the executive director of AALL. Could you talk about the changes in the organizational structure of AALL's headquarters and in the association's financial record-keeping systems that you initiated from your position as president, and why you and the executive board thought at that time that these were necessary?
There's a lot there. I think I would like to refer back to the early committees about, for instance, the organizational structure. One thing I want to say from the start is that in those years there were relatively few very active law firm people in the association. You know, and we know, you and I know, that the association has had a very small number of law firm presidents.
Yes.
I think Elizabeth Findlay, Jack Ellenberger, and then Carolyn Ahern, Mark Estes, and me. Apologies if I've missed somebody in the Findlay, Ellenberger period.
I think you've covered the firm librarians.
I was asked to chair the Committee on Organizational Structure by Albert Brecht, and I think that there are some significant people who gave me opportunities to do things, and they did so and there are a number of them, who looked to people in the law firm community, people in courts, but to the breadth of AALL. And I think it was quite unusual for a law firm person to be asked to chair the Organizational Structure Committee. I had done other things. You mentioned the future of AALL. I served in the trenches on committees about publications and some other things. But it really is about people who are more senior in the association reaching out to newer generations. And I read recently the tributes to Albert Brecht in the Law Library Journal, and many people talked about his interest in people and his mentoring. And that he's one of several mentors that I can point to in the association. I think that the Organizational Structure Committee was significant because it really did open the door to the SISs and to the ways in which we're organized now. I served first on the executive board. I believe that the publicity of the Organizational Structure Committee gave me name recognition that enabled me to successfully win the election for the executive board. That coincided also with the Atlanta meeting, which was in '88. I believe I went on the executive board the first time after an election, in '88 perhaps. But I think also the preliminary times about the annual meeting and my role assisting the local chairperson on the meeting gave me also name recognition. I was 1 year off of the executive board before being asked to run for vice president and president-elect. In my first term on the executive board, Bill Jepsen was the executive director. Bill brought a lot of experience of association management, but not a librarian or professional association management in the way that we might think about the American Bar or one of the library associations. He was a nice fellow who really tried to do his best for the association. I think it came to a point where, and I wasn't directly involved in these activities, the association realized it wanted to move more to someone who had familiarity with librarianship. And Judy Jensen was the replacement for Bill Jepsen. Judy took us to another level in terms of her, the respect she garnered in the publishing community, and certainly with our members. Judy was a librarian, carried that background, and I believe expanded on the staff at headquarters. I'm still in touch with Bill Jepsen. I'm still in touch with Judy Jensen. Around the time of Mark Estes' presidency and Carolyn Ahern's, both preceded me immediately, there was a feeling that the association needed more professional management in terms of its finances and needed to staff up in that area with people who had greater expertise. Judy turned in her resignation at the same time that transition was made to get greater financial management and perhaps greater experience in association management. I think probably if you looked at our revenues and our budgets, we were kind of on a cusp as we moved through those late 80s, early 90s years in terms of our revenues going up, also the need to budget, need to have a greater asset and have professional management for that. The search for Roger Parent took place during the year that ended with Mark's 92 or 93 Boston meeting. 93 Boston meeting. And we hired a professional search firm. The committee included board members and others. We took very seriously our headhunters' recommendations. We talked to probably 5 or 6 people meetings that brought us together in Chicago to talk to people, to spend some time with them, go out for a social function, whether it was a lunch or a dinner, to try to identify who the best candidate was. Roger was then associate director, I think one of maybe two associate directors at the American Library Association. On the financial side, he was superbly qualified. He was made the kind of impression that we wanted in terms of an executive director. Continued the way we presented ourselves that Judy, I think, had done very well as well. Roger brought to the table, though, an incredible level of association management and dealing with revenues far beyond ours for a far bigger association. He had supported the board. His experience was tremendous. And I think we were so delighted he was interested in us. I found out later that he was just hoping we would be interested in him. So it was one of those mutual things, the right person at the right time. Roger then brought in a CPA to manage our finances, to look at how who we were getting to manage our investments, to look at budgeting that was increasingly sophisticated to support what we were doing, to look at cost-benefit analysis, to look at attributing staff costs back to the project they worked on so we could get a better idea of how staff costs were really distributed across our activities. Obviously that was Steve Ligda, and he gave us even a longer term of service than Roger did, and Steve was really tremendous. Both of those two were tremendous in their skills, in how they gave us connection to the outside world, but also with the way that they interacted with members.
Well, the association had grown tremendously and had become a lot more diverse. I mean, for a while it was mostly the academic directors and a small, primarily social group which got together once a year, and they exchanged information and networked and did important things.
Right.
But as more librarians from other sectors started to arrive on the scene and join the ALL, the needs had obviously shifted to broadening the focus of the association and also empowering these people who didn't have perhaps as much encouragement from their employers to devote large amounts of time to association work. Had to empower them to be involved, and that led to the addition initially of an executive director and then the various other staffing positions. So there was a lot of growing pains. And Mark and you were sort of at the point when we had solved getting a handle on the national meeting, the annual meeting. That was sort of Jepson's role and why he was hired, I understand, because he had the expertise and went about it very well.
Yes.
And then Judy sort of professionalized the office in a different way. Now it was time to get better control of this thing that had grown. And you and Mark and others who were in the leadership at that time, that was when it all came about.
I think there's some things about the board and about how the board operates that I am proud of. During the years with Mark and some of the later ones, we started, I think, focusing the board on the things the board ought to do, bigger picture things. Mm-hmm. We were putting in place staff that had the skills, and the board was able to begin to step back from being concerned about whether they were making the right decisions about small things. Mm-hmm. And that had to happen in order for us to keep good staff who would be reinforced by the fact that we gave them a role and had confidence in their doing it, or we later took action if they weren't doing the job, but we didn't micromanage. Board training has been enormously important in that. There are many things that I look back on that I'm very proud of, and some of them started about that time when we started to link our educational programming to an overall structure where we looked at learning outcomes. That's the responsibility of many, many people, but it's something that I'm proud that I've seen.
Well, you truly were a major part of that transformation. And it was time. I mean, the association had diversified and grown. We had brought on these people who were skilled at what they did. We got the last piece finally together early on, about the time you were president and shortly thereafter, which was the putting everything together from an accounting standpoint properly. And the association has actually been perhaps much the better since then because
I think
of
the
this.
financial policies that came about over the course of several years with special committees looking at financial policies, the agreement on the implementation of some fairly standard associational policies, but not the financial, not the way we had done business before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now the very careful budgeting and the agreements on what kinds of budgeting will be done is a real tribute to Roger and to Steve Ligda and to the boards then. And I also think that we have come through economic trauma a couple of times, and we've done remarkably well. The association has managed its cost, but they've also had careful understanding of the importance of the investment fund, the permanent investment fund, setting up various other funds, doing business by funds. And I think the association is, obviously it needs to be concerned about all the things associations are, its continuing membership numbers, but I feel that the association has put itself on a firm financial footing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we obviously acknowledge that from your era, at least the beginning of it, and it's been carried forward by your successors in the presidency and on the board, and that's good. Now, one of the focuses today, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about that era, because it was, I think, in the changes, a very important part of a history of our profession, certainly during our years as active parts of the profession. But I don't want to downplay the fact that, you know, when I look at who's doing what currently in the association over the years since, there's your name, Kay, time and again. For example, just this year alone, you're chair of the rather important AELL Guide to Fair Business Practices for Law Publishers, revising the rules that govern that, the task force.
It's my third go-around with the Fair Business Practices Guide. I was on the committee that did it the first time, then I chaired the revision, and then I've chaired this revision. Mm-hmm. During my time as president and on the board, I always thought that we were a huge market, but that we could do more by being in a collaborative mode, and that it would behoove us to listen to publishers, and by that methodology get them to listen to us. And there really was a two-way street. There were several colloquia during the early 90s and perhaps later 90s as they were carried forward. A chance for librarians to sit down with top-level people in the corporations with which we were doing business. I think those not inroads exactly, but perhaps those outreach efforts were very beneficial as our members, who are so highly qualified and so professional, got a chance to present themselves and their issues to publishers. And I think that value has always been there. Fair Business Practice Guide suggests that there are some pretty basic principles that we would like publishers to follow, and that everybody would acknowledge this is reasonable, except perhaps for the outlier occasionally. But generally, the guide is there to provide something for librarians to point to and say, you see, you really should be providing me with free replacement pages. You should be accepting returns. You shouldn't be sending me unsolicited materials. I think that the revision that we've just completed is perhaps even more a user-friendly tool with a few more practices to avoid, practices to follow. But I think it is really a good tool. It's been inquired about by other law library associations and commented on by other library associations. I think in our industry and related industries, it is respected. And every time a law librarian says she uses it or he uses it, I feel gratified.
Well, I think our more responsible colleagues on the other side of the equation, the book companies, the publishers, this day and age it isn't all books by any matter of means, they've participated in this.
Yes.
The good ones want to do business in ways that people like what they're doing, and these guidelines have got to be very helpful to them because it tells them what it is we as consumers of their products find desirable and, more particularly important perhaps, not so desirable.
Yeah.
It's like these telemarketers that violate the national do not call list by calling your phone at home. You know, you've already signaled by putting yourself on the list, I think, that you don't want those calls.
That's true.
But they think you'll love them, and
yes,
they must.
We've had good participation by people in the publishing industry, certainly on the 2 revisions. We benefited this time from our colleague at BNA, Mike Bernier, who provided insight. And I think in the dialogue that this task force has had this past year and in previous years, we've occasionally encountered things where it's in the guide, but if you ask a publisher colleague, they'll say, for my company, that's really hard to do. We really won't be able to fully comply with that piece of it. And so I think it sets a high standard. Certainly there may be people who think it should set an even more aggressive standard, but I really think that we've hit a good level of some pragmatic principles that are attainable and that certainly should be aspired to by publishers.
I think that's all very important work, and I want to thank you, as I'm no longer an active law librarian, but I certainly know the profession is better off because of this and all the other things you've done for us over the years, Kay.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, Kay Todd, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking these few moments to share so much about yourself and our profession. Before closing, however, is there anything you would like to add as we conclude this interview?
I guess the only thing is that I continue to be proud of the association, and as I left elected leadership, I left with the assumption that the board is usually well informed and that I would put my faith in boards and be a past president who was supportive of efforts and tried to understand change. And that's what I continue to do. There's some wonderful things happening in the association. Basically, short term to put on educational programs, a wider range of educational programs, and now another law firm president. So I'm very, very pleased with the association. Someone once said that activities in the association made their job more than a job. And I think that's what AALL has been to many of us. It's made our job more than a job and provided us the professional contacts and the enrichment that made our work life very pleasant. Thanks, Pat, for doing this project.
Thank you. I'm having a wonderful time. I appreciate being thanked, but as you know, I had to miss a few meetings over the years because of other circumstances, and now, even though I'm retired, being able to go around and talk with people like you, Kay, old friends and colleagues, it's just like we pick up as if we'd had lunch last week. It's been a wonderful experience.
The conversation continues.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.